This is technically a sequel to my IwaOi lyric confession, link in description, but it can also be watched as a standalone. Thanks to lazy_mocha for the request. Iwaizumi slid his phone into his pocket and continued the short distance to Turo's home. He felt like he was in a fever dream walking the empty, dark streets, en route to his boyfriend's place. Boyfriend. Because somehow the boy he'd been irrevocably in love with since he first understood what the word meant had told him he felt the same way. It was hard to believe. After all, Toru could arguably have whomever he wanted, his horde of fangirls certainly seemed to think so, yet he chose Hajime. Plain, grouchy Hajime. He didn't bother trying to tamp down the giddy smile currently taking hostage of his face as he unlocked the gate of the Oikawa residence and slipped past their front door. He stopped at the base of a tree he'd climbed several times in the past, staring at the branch hanging closest to Turo's window. As an energetic child who hung around in trees for fun, the climb used to be a breeze. But despite his physical advantages that came with multiple growth spurts and years of taking care of his body, the task seemed a little daunting now. Curse Toru for his flair for the dramatics. And curse himself for finding it so goddamn endearing. Resigned to his fate, and praying he was still able to fit through the window, Iwaizumi tied the plastic bag he was carrying around one of his wrists. Satisfied he wouldn't drop it, he turned to the task at hand before pausing at the sight of Auntie's flower bed running alongside the house. He thought back to the last half hour and couldn't help but cringe at the memory of his own confession. He really wasn't the best when it came to romantic gestures, having never experienced anything of that nature before. But now that he knew Toru had such high expectations for this moment, and it's not as if he himself hadn't fantasized about it. Mind made up, Iwaizumi bent over and plucked a single rose, sending a silent apology to Auntie. Not wanting to damage the flower, he held the stem between his teeth, ignoring the stinging of the thorns against his lips. He tried not to picture the looks in Matsukawa and Hanamaki's faces if they could see him now. After a final check to ensure everything on his person was secure, Iwaizumi began his ascent. Feeling out the familiar footholds along the trunk and pulling himself from branch to branch, he managed to reach his destination in record time. He peered into Turo's bedroom. It was completely dark save for a weak beam of light coming from somewhere on the right, the source of which he knew to be a bedside lamp. Not wanting to be outside any longer than necessary, Iwaizumi carefully leant forward and rapped on the window pane with his free hand. He waited several beats, balancing all the while, until it finally opened. Trusting him to have stepped away and not lingered, Iwaizumi quickly plunged. He had to twist a bit awkwardly in order to squeeze through, especially when the bag got caught on the sill, but his feet eventually found the floor as he righted himself. Iwa-chan. Iwaizumi glanced up from where he had begun untying the bag from his wrist, halting as he and Toru made eye contact. It seemed he found his glasses, was the first thought that flashed through his mind. Immediately following it was a single word on repeat, cute. The slight furrowing of Turo's brows drew Iwaizumi's attention away from the accessory. Is that a rose from our flower bed? He felt his cheeks warming as Toru raised his hand to stroke the petals, a small smile forming on his face. How romantic. Toru pinched an empty portion of the stem, willing Iwaizumi to let go. As soon as it was pulled from his mouth, however, Iwaizumi couldn't hold back a wince. Oh, Toru gasped softly. You idiot. He carefully placed the rose on his nightstand before returning his full attention to Iwaizumi. The latter could feel the sharp, minuscule cuts along his lips and inside his mouth now that the thorns weren't nestled into his skin. In hindsight, he should have expected this. But he couldn't bring himself to be too annoyed when Toru was looking at him like that. It's not too bad. He shrugged and muttered anyway. Toru rolled his eyes. And you say I'm the dumbass. His cheeks puffed slightly as he began to examine the damage. Despite the intentions behind Turo's focus, Iwaizumi couldn't help but want to fidget. He had felt rather brave earlier when he claimed he couldn't wait any longer to kiss Toru, but now with his mouth under intense scrutiny and their faces so close, only his nerves remained. It didn't help at all when a smirk appeared. Do you want me to kiss it better? His tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it too. Something serious. Questioning. Against it all, however, Iwaizumi felt the corners of his lip twitch at the phrasing. He was reminded of all the times Toru had demanded he kiss it better, when they were kids. Any scrape or bruise he'd acquire when Iwaizumi had dragged him outside to go exploring or bug hunting, no matter how small, would get a kiss. It had been years since the last time he'd done that. Probably not since middle school, considering that was when they stopped doing a lot of things that would have been considered inappropriate for two male friends. Things like holding hands. Iwaizumi glanced at Turo's hands now, which were currently cradling his face. When had that happened? One of his thumbs gently brushing over his lips. An odd mixture of emotions flittered through him then, mainly from the prospect of being able to hold hands again, excitement, nostalgia, a twinge of sadness, but the sudden rush of anticipation was all from kissing. Toru, he murmured, eyes flickering to meet the others. Bright, doe-eyed Brown stared back from behind the frames he adored so much, and he was once again in awe of the fact that this man was his best friend, his setter, his partner, his boyfriend, his Oikawa Toru, Hajime. Iwaizumi took the single step that separated them, his hands coming to clutch at Turo's pajama-cladded waist, uncaring as the bag still attached to his wrist bumped against their thighs. The two on his face shifted so one cupped his cheek and the other the back of his neck, both guiding him to Toru. He didn't know when his eyes had slid shut, but when the press of a mouth against his finally came his awareness returned in full, and with it the realization that he couldn't see, just feel. Fingers in hair, stroking of cheeks, quiet exhales, scrunched fabric, the upwards tilt of his own head. The latter was further evidence of the height difference between them, but for once Iwaizumi didn't care about the few inches Toru had on him. Knowing it bothered him for so long seemed absolutely ridiculous in the moment. A slow swipe of the tongue across his bottom lip momentarily eased the lingering sting from the scratches and dragged Iwaizumi from his thoughts. It wasn't long after he released a satisfied sigh as he and Toru pulled away from each other. They allowed themselves a few seconds more to divulge in the blissful atmosphere before eventually blinking their eyes open, each being greeted by the other's smile. I love you. I love you too, Shirikawa. Iwaizumi laughed as Toru smacked his shoulder, dispelling the tension. Even so, Iwaizumi couldn't help himself from snatching Turo's hand from the air, giving it a squeeze which, in turn, earned him a soft, fond look. If Iwaizumi was more of a romantic, he might say there was something almost poetic in the way that after so many years, the next stage of their relationship began with Toru kissing Iwaizumi in a mock role reversal of what was not only a common practice from when they were children, but also the first outward display of Iwaizumi caring for Toru. But he wasn't, and Iwaizumi had something more tangible to focus his energy on right now. By the way, what's in the bag? Ah, I almost forgot. Iwaizumi, with much reluctance, dropped Turo's hand to finish untying the knot and handed the bag over. Milk bread. Turo's face lit up as he pulled out the goods. I grabbed the last of what we had on my way out. He hugged Iwaizumi then started pulling him towards the bed. Come on. Let's eat, cuddle, and reminisce on all the time we wasted pining for each other when we could have already been dating. Iwaizumi chuckled as he let himself be dragged across the room. Whatever you want, Toru. Iwaizumi slowly blinked away the remnants of sleep as he regained consciousness. He barely had time to register that it was much too early for him to already be awake when the creaking of the door alerted him to someone's presence. Managing to lift his head enough to see over Turo's body, which was comfortably pressed against his side, Iwaizumi stared wide-eyed at Auntie who was standing on the threshold to the bedroom, her arms crossed and a brow raised in a familiar, intimidating fashion. Feeling a surge of panic despite having already been caught cuddling her son, in his bed, in a home he had definitely not been in when the heads of the household had gone to sleep the night before, Iwaizumi attempted to quickly but carefully dislodge himself from Turo's clutches. Don't bother, Hajime. Iwaizumi froze as the soft-spoken words reached his ears. He chanced a glance at her again, relieved to see a face of mirth staring back. Your mother called looking for you. I'll be sure to let her know you're in good hands. He blushed at the phrasing and the playful tone that accompanied it. Thank you, Obasan. She made a hand gesture as if to wave away the words. I'll let you kids sleep in a bit longer. We'll have a late breakfast. She turned to leave but stopped halfway, her eyes momentarily flickering to something on the nightstand. She threw a pointed glance at Iwaizumi. I'm sure the shops have lovely bouquets for sale this time of year. Do try to keep away from my flowers, dear. With that she retreated, closing the door behind her. Iwaizumi let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and let his head drop onto the pillow. He groaned quietly. Well, that's one parent's approval. He jolted at the sudden voice and turned to catch Turo's gaze. The previously sleeping boy had one of his eyes cracked open and was sporting a tiny grin. Iwaizumi huffed, allowing himself to relax further into the bed. Guess so. Come on, she's granted us a few extra hours of rest and I intend to use them. Toru chuckled and burrowed his head into the crook of Iwaizumi's neck, who hugged him close in return. They both shut their eyes and hummed contentedly, allowing sleep to claim them once more.